On today's podcast, we are exploring the history of Hever Castle. Hever Castle in Kent is best known as the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, but it has a richer and wider history than just that link to the famous second wife of Henry VIII. So I am very, very happy to be joined today by historian and Hever Castle supervisor Dr. Owen Emmerson to explore the wide and varied history of Hever Castle. We're going to be discussing right back to the origins of the castle. We will, of course, be talking about the links to Anne Boleyn and also the links to Henry's fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. But let's also look at what happened after the Tudors. And we must talk about the Astors and saving Hever. I also want to ask Owen about Hever in the 20th century when we had the world wars. What was Hever's part in the war effort, if any? And we're going to finish off talking about some of the amazing artefacts and pieces of art that are here at Hever. So it's going to be a packed episode full of very interesting topics and talk. So stay tuned. You're going to really enjoy this one. Let me first extend a warm welcome to all of you listening at home, and of course to Owen, who's sat opposite me. We're in Hever Castle doing this podcast, so it's a very exciting day for me, at least. Hopefully Owen will also enjoy me probing him for lots of information on the castle and its history. But without further ado, welcome Owen. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so very much. It's wonderful to have you here at Hever Castle.
Give us a bit of your background. Why are you the man to be talking to?
My name is Dr. Owen Emmerson. I'm a social and cultural historian. I completed my PhD research at the University of Sussex. I studied the abolition of corporal punishment, and I'm incredibly privileged to work here at Hever Castle as the castle supervisor.
Okay, so I'd like to start by dialing it right back and talk about the origins of the site and the castle itself. So do we know much about the origins of this site and when there was first a dwelling here?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously Hever has an incredibly rich and famous history, but the further back we get, the more opaque that history becomes. And the history of Hever Castle, which used to be called Hever Cobham, is slightly problematised by the fact that there are actually two manors at Hever. They're roughly a mile apart. One is called Hever Cobham, that's the castle that we're currently in, and there's also Hever Brocas. So as we get further back in history, the manors are often just referred to as the manor of Hever, and it becomes very complicated to discern which Hever the person in the document is talking about. But what we do know is that the lands here were once owned by a man called Stephen de Penchester. He was the Sheriff of Kent and also the warden of the Cinque Ports. And he owned a huge amount of Kentish lands, including the land that Hever Cobham now stands on. And the first real sort of concrete evidence that we have of a dwelling here, although that there are sort of rumours of earlier buildings here, comes with a gentleman called William de Hever, who was descended from a Norman baron. He too was Sheriff of Kent in 1272, and we know that he had a manor here on the site. So it's not a particularly clear-cut answer for you, but that's the first real indication that we have a manor house here.
Okay, so we start with a manor house.
That's right.
So when did it become referred to as a castle?
Sure. So there is a licence to crenellate a manor at Hever in 1271, which is why the castle has often been dated to 1271. But there's also a licence to crenellate in 1383. And it's possible that one of those licences relates to Hever Brocas and one relates to Hever Cobham. That's Hever Castle today. And there's been a lot of sort of mystery around which one applies to which. But John Goodall, architectural historian, and Pevsner both date this castle, Hever Cobham, to 1383. That's why it's called Hever Cobham. Essentially, it was built by the Cobham family.
Oh, okay. I was wondering why a Cobham. I thought it was some old word for sort of a manor house or something. So now ramparts obviously have become a bit of a decorative feature much later on, but the date you're giving, that's still a time where we've got, civil wars and stuff like that. So what is the reason for, getting crenellations and ramparts and things like that added to a manor house at that time?
Sure. Well, 1383 is just 2 years after the famous Peasants' Revolt,
Of course, yeah.
which is a popular uprising led by Wat Tyler, and that was really underpinned by huge socio-economic turmoil. We had the Black Death, and also huge rising taxation due to funding the 100 Years' War with France. Now, just 2 years after John de Cobham of Devonshire is granted a licence to crenellate Hever Cobham, Simon Sudbury, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury and the ultimate tax collector, is dragged from the Tower of London and beheaded by the peasants. Now, John de Cobham of Devonshire is a tax collector. He's a tax collector in nearby Sussex, and therefore you might understand why he would want to build a nice castle around his manor and located in the next county in a valley away from the people that he is taxing.
So he's looking to obviously make his house much, much more secure. Are we seeing the moat turn up at this sort of era as well, or?
Yeah, very much so. So in terms of the licence to crenellate, which is a licence bequested by the monarch to the nobility in order to better protect their houses. So you have to have permission to do so. And that's when we would have seen the moat, the keep, the curtain walls, which surround the castle now, and also those crenellations at the top, which probably were decorative. They were probably a warning to the local populace. But increasingly, licenses to crenellate are granted as a bit of swank, really. They are a reflection of the status of the nobility. So as we go into peacetime, such licenses are still granted, but they're probably granted more on the basis that the owner wanted to reflect the status that they were or had achieved.
Right.
So the nobility would very much want their manors to be crenellated because it was an indication that you were supported by the monarch, essentially.
Excellent. Okay. So I was wondering, I don't know whether the moat is ever dredged or how it's looked after, but has it been? Is there anything interesting been ever found in the moat?
One of the things I would love to go back and witness was William Wardolph Astor restoring the moat, because when he purchased the castle in 1903, he made the moat much more regular, much more square than it originally was. It was a bit more fluid. It didn't have such defined outer walls. And in order to do so, he had to empty the moat, and we've got some wonderful pictures of some of the early masonry that was revealed when he did so. But sadly, we don't have any documentation of what exactly was found. I mean, it would have been so thrilling to have been here on that day.
You've got to think someone's dropped something interesting.
Oh my goodness, yeah. But to be honest, the only thing of interest that I can definitely say was found in the moat was not that long ago. We found a sword, but not a particularly old one.
Oh.
It was dropped by Tom Baker in 1984 when he filmed The Passionate Pilgrim here. And he was fighting on the drawbridge and unfortunately dropped his sword into the moat. And there it was when we dredged the moat sticking up out of the silt. So we do have Tom Baker's sword, but it's not particularly old.
Not particularly old. A prop.
Indeed.
What What are the oldest parts of the castle then surviving? Do you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So we really do have three main periods that are quite distinct. So the oldest part of the castle really is that iconic keep and the curtain walls that surround the manor house. They date from 1383, and also the Great Hall. Which is for all intents and purposes, the dining hall of the castle. That also dates to that era. Then there are alterations to the layout of the house, because this always was a house. Castles generally are always houses. They're just very well protected ones. And those alterations come when the Boleyn family purchased the castle in 1462. And they're mainly structural, and they include the extension of the family rooms from the lower floor to the upper floor, the creation of a great chamber, a solar, which is now known as three rooms: the Anne Boleyn bedroom, the Books of Hours room, and also the Queen's chamber. That really is the heart of the family home that is created by the Boleyns. And then, of course, we have periods of restoration. The first one to note happened in the 1830s by an owner called Jane Waldo. She very much brought the castle up to a Victorian standard. And then shortly thereafter, Captain Guy Seabright, made alterations by way of taking everything that Jane Waldo put in out, and really making Hever structurally sound again. He very much wanted to purchase Hever, but he was sadly outbid by the incredibly wealthy William Waldorf Astor in 1903, who really elevated Hever to the status that you see it in today.
And we'll come back to the Astors, because I want to explore further their part in Hever and what we see today. So just before we move on to talk about some of the most famous residents of Hever, what time period then are we talking in the castle that we see today? What time period of building are we seeing? So we're going right back to
1383, and the last major alterations that were made were by the Astors. So there's nothing structurally that is different. Really post the floods, which I'm sure we'll touch upon later. When the introduction of three small bedrooms, the dog kennels right at the top of the castle, were hurriedly created to give some sanctuary to the Astor's children. But that was the last major alteration to the castle. And quite honestly, the survival of the castle, very much in the way that the Boleyns would have known it, is testament both to the love of the Boleyns that William Waldorf Astor had. He changed very little to do with the layout of the castle. But it's also a testament to the fact that for the vast majority of its post-Boleyn history, Hever Castle was let out. It wasn't lived in by its owners, and therefore structurally very little was done to it, because tenants are far less likely to make lasting alterations to a property than their owners.
Okay, so I want to move on to Hever's links to Anne Boleyn and, of course, Anne of Cleves. So Hever is obviously famous worldwide for being the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII. But when did Anne Boleyn live here, and who was she living here with?
Sure, that's a really good question. Now, of course, Anne was never meant to be queen, and therefore information about her prior to her elevation is scant, to say the least. Having said that, she's often portrayed as being some kind of or having some kind of rags to riches experience when she meets Henry VIII. Nothing could be further from the truth. She is an incredibly wealthy, she brought up in an incredibly wealthy households, I should say, because her family is incredibly prestigious. And the Boleyns don't only own Hever, they own a whole host of properties. So, for example, Blickling in Norfolk, where Anne is most likely born. They also own a manor at Hoo in Luton. They have Rochford Hall in Essex, a number of townhouses, and of course the Boleyns have apartments at every court location. That being said, we do know that Thomas Boleyn inherits Hever Castle in 1505 from his father William Boleyn. And also we know that William gifted Elizabeth, that's Thomas's wife, a lifetime stake in Hever Castle, so she is a co-owner of it. Now that's our first clue that this was the childhood home of Anne Boleyn. It's most likely that it was gifted to Elizabeth for her lifetime because it was going to be the residence in which her children were brought up. Having said that, this wasn't there. The children wouldn't have exclusively been brought up in this household. But we do have other clues that this was a primary residence for the children, not least the graves of both Thomas and Henry Boleyn, who are the other Boleyn children that we don't particularly hear about often, but who we know died in or around Hever. So Thomas Boleyn Jr. is buried at Penshurst, and Henry Boleyn is buried next to his father Thomas Boleyn up at Hever Church. So again, that gives us a good indication that this was the location where the children were brought up.
Now, Anne was courted by Henry VIII, I think for around 6 years, if I'm correct. So do we know if he ever visited her here? Bearing in mind she's got all these other residences as well, but...
Absolutely, it's a great question and one that we get asked a lot here. The simple answer is we can't say for certain. That we don't have that smoking gun piece of evidence that says Henry VIII came to visit Anne Boleyn here. But I do think we can safely say that it's highly likely that he did. Hever's seclusion in the Kentish Weald makes it the ideal place for Anne to retreat to when things hot up at court. And we know that she comes back to Hever time and time again in the 1520s, and Henry bombards her with love letters here. And we also know that Henry VIII owns nearby Penshurst Place, which would be a very convenient location to stay at if you wanted to visit your loved one here at Hever in the relative privacy of these crenellated walls.
Now, we're going to move on to the other Anne. Right, so now Anne Boleyn is not obviously the only one of Henry's wives with links to Hever. Indeed, the other Anne in Henry VIII's lineup of 6 wives, Anne of Cleves, is also an important figure here, isn't she? So can you please tell us how Anne of Cleves is linked to Hever?
Yeah, absolutely. So when Anne's very brief marriage to Henry collapses in July of 1540, Henry affords upon her an incredibly generous allowance in the annulment settlement. He also gives her the use of 2 palaces, Richmond and Bletchingley, and she's also allowed to rent Hever Castle, and she's also gifted a number of smaller properties, such as a house in Ditchling and also in nearby Lewes, which she could then rent out to glean further income.
Okay. And so did Anne ever live here?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have a number of pieces of correspondence to, firstly, Queen Mary, which places her very squarely here at Hever Castle. But also more recently, we've done a lot of digging and found other pieces of correspondence to her brother back in Cleves, that's William or Wilhelm, which tell us that she's very much more here than previously had been anticipated. I would suggest that she probably uses Hever when she drops down in status. So when King Henry VIII dies and she's sort of relegated from the status of being the king's sister to the king's aunt when Edward VI is on the throne. And he actually revokes her right to live at the palaces of Richmond and Bletchingley. And it appears that a lot of the correspondence from Hever is after that time. So I would suggest that she probably uses Hever far more during those years, sort of post-Henry. And we do know that in recompense for the loss of Richmond and Bletchingley, she's offered Penshurst, but she refuses it on the basis that she already occupies Hever.
Okay, so I want to move on now to after the Tudors. So the Reformation, which began during the Tudor period, saw successive monarchs taking the pendulum back and forth between Catholicism and the Reformed religion, which obviously became known as Protestantism, and it gave real life difficulties to people living at the time. And Hever's history illustrates in its fabric some of this, which I'd like to explore with you now, if that's okay. So first of all, for anyone who isn't aware of the religious changes which happened during the Tudor and early Stuart period, are you able to summarise, as best anyone can, what was happening during this period? And then we'll move on to looking specifically at how Hever can help us understand those real-life consequences of those religious changes.
Sure. Okay, so this is a huge subject, but I'll put it as simply as possible. So essentially, there was a schism or a split in the Catholic Church, which sought to return or reform the institution that had built up around the faith, with an aim to sort of return to the teachings of the gospel and to move away from what were seen as corruptions of power and practice. Now, the Henrican Reformation, so here in England, really begins here at Hever Castle. It's an incredibly important location for that reason. This really is where it all begins, because it's arguably here that Anne is exposed to radical new ideas about faith, which actually were non-schismatic. Her ideas of reform weren't about breaking away, but reforming from within. And she was also exposed to these ideas when she went abroad to the French court, and she was undoubtedly exposed to them within her reformist family. And it's also here at Hever Castle that Anne agrees to marry Henry. We know that she did so during the Christmas of 1526 when she is in residence here. Now, of course, Henry cannot secure an annulment from his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The Pope refuses to do so. And it's Anne that introduces Henry to the then deemed heretical works of William Tyndale, who proclaimed that kings and not the Pope should be accountable to God. And of course, Henry makes the monumental decision to break with Rome in order to marry Anne and creates his own Catholic Church of England. So there's a schism, but Henry isn't breaking away from Catholicism. He's creating his own church, but very much mirroring the practices and teachings of that faith. But this has huge implications for what happens next, and none more so with the lives of his own children. His son Edward, who is next in line, is a staunch Protestant. He is the first Protestant king, and he rules out his sisters from the line of succession, for example, particularly his elder sister Mary, who is next in line, in favour of his cousin, who becomes a very brief Queen Jane. And of course, when Mary then wins the throne, she oversees a counter-reformation, returning to Rome, and of course we see the Marian persecutions. A huge number of Protestants are persecuted during Mary's reign. Elizabeth, who then succeeds from Mary, returns to her own Church of England, and again we see an increase during her reign of persecutions of Catholics. So this, as you noted, this pendulum is swinging throughout the reign of Henry's children.
And so, just briefly then, as we go into the early Stuart period, so you've got a bedroom here called the Waldegrave Room, and off that room is a small private chapel. So, actually, before we talk about that chapel, can we first tell us who the Waldegraves were when they came into possession of the castle and etc.?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So Edward Waldegrave is very much, I think, a victim of this schism, of this turmoil that the country is thrown into. I would argue he's almost like a weather vane of the tortuous winds that are created as a result of that schism. So he is initially part of the Lady Mary's household. He is a practicing Catholic, and indeed when Edward becomes king, he becomes a recusant Catholic. He refuses to adhere to the Protestant services, and he's actually thrown into the Tower in 1551 in response to him refusing to ban the Mass being said in Mary's household. He is released from the Tower when Mary succeeds to the throne and is elevated. He's given a knighthood, he's placed on Mary's council, and he's given the right to buy Hever Castle. But everything comes crashing down for Edward when Mary dies, and of course the Protestant Elizabeth becomes queen. He is thrown into the Tower again in 1561 during Elizabeth's reign on the basis of an incredibly spurious plot which was created entirely, it seems, by William Cecil. It was called the Waldegrave Conspiracy. It was a way of whipping up fear and hatred of Catholics, and it really was in response to Robert Dudley's intention to marry Elizabeth. William Cecil very much thought that Dudley would require the support of Spain in order to secure a position as consort, and therefore Cecil decided that whipping up a bit of fear about Catholics would do the trick in terms of persuading Elizabeth not to go down that route. Edward's wife accompanies him to the Tower because she similarly refuses to pay a fine of 100 marks for refusing to adhere to the faith and for allowing priests to say Mass in their household. And very sadly, Edward dies on the 1st of September in 1561 in the Tower of natural causes. But what a life of turmoil that he experienced because of the schism that happened in his very own household at Hever Castle.
And so the Waldegrave Room, this is the one that has this beautiful little chapel off it. Can you explain to us what the chapel would have looked like? So, was it hidden? Was it open? Why was it there?
Sure. Right, so I'm going to be quite coy here because, and I'll explain why shortly, but this room wasn't always called the Waldegrave Room. When I was a child, it was called the Rochford Room and was known as George's bedroom. That's Anne's brother. And we also know that before it was called the Rochford Room, it was called the Garden Room at one stage. Now, I can't say too much about the chapel and its history because new research by the incredible Professor Simon Thurley has been done, and it wouldn't be right for me to reveal his research. But I think it's safe to say that it's rather problematic. It has a rather problematic history. But what I can say is very much now a memorial to that need for prayer in seclusion, the need to hide one's faith. And that's why it's sort of very much linked to the Waldegraves, who were very much persecuted for their faith. We also similarly have a priest hole in what was the parlour, now the morning room. And again, that's a reflection or a nod to the fact that once upon a time, because of the turmoil that happened here with Anne Boleyn and Henry's desire to marry her, that the subsequent owners of Hever suffered, and the fabric of their house had to change physically to reflect that need to hide one's faith. So sorry not to give you a more definitive answer. Do watch this space because Hever has invested a huge amount in trying to uncover a lot of the physical history of the castle, and we're really excited to hopefully be able to share it with you in the near future.
Excellent. Well, I'll be back to find out the info when you...
Yes, please do.
Okay, so we hear a lot about Hever in the Tudor period, understandably, because of Anne Boleyn. And we've been exploring into the beginning of the Stuart period and the Waldegraves. And we also hear a lot about the Astors, who came into the ownership of Hever, as you said, in 1903. And I want to come back to them. First of all, though, before we do, that's a gap of almost 300 years. So it's a huge question. But what happened at Hever in those 3 centuries?
Absolutely. It is a large question, but I think it can be very quickly summed up by 2 words: to let. The Waldegraves who we talked about, Edward Waldegrave, was probably the only Waldegrave that actually lived at Hever. They owned the castle for longer than any other family, 150 years. But for the vast majority of that time, the Waldegraves let this out for further income. And the same can be said for the Humphreys family, the Waldo family, and the Mead Waldos, who choose to let this place out for income, most notably to tenant farmers because of the rich farmland and also the Kentish weald that surrounded the castle. Now, some of the owners did live here, such as Jane Waldo, who we talked about very briefly, who did choose to live here, and she, of course, renovated the castle in the 1830s. But by and large, it is let out, and I think that really helps to underpin why so much of the Boleyn's house survives. We touched upon that very briefly earlier, but if you're letting a place, you're far less likely to make those physical alterations than if you're living here as an owner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, so let's move on to the Astors now. Is it too grand a statement to say that the Astors saved Hever?
No, I don't think it is. But they probably didn't save it in quite the way that the Astors wanted us to believe. So there is a myth that this place was incredibly dilapidated. There was almost in ruins. Actually, we've got really good and solid photographic evidence that the other saviour, who we need to talk about, Captain Guy Seabright, had actually made this house incredibly sound and really ready for the Astors to sort of gild the lily. He did a huge amount structurally to the castle, replacing those rotten beams that Astor liked to tell everyone that were here. And he also put a lot of effort into stripping out the Victoriana that had been placed by the Mead Waldo family. So he really sort of had stripped Hever back to its lath and plaster walls, and fully intended to live here himself and to purchase the castle from the Mead Waldos, but he just simply couldn't contend with William Waldorf Astor's incredible fortune. And Astor does what Seabright and basically no one else could do. He lavishes absolute fortune on the place, millions and millions of dollars on renovating both the castle, adding an extension, and also landscaping the gardens that we all love and enjoy today.
So who were the Astors? Let's go back a step, and because like you said, they had an incredible amount of money to spend. Who were they? Where do they come from?
Sure, absolutely. So I like to think of them as very much like the Boleyns, actually. They make their money through trade initially and make some very advantageous marriages. But the family originate from Germany, and their industry is really around the fur trade initially. That then extends to property. The Astors become the landlords of Manhattan. They own huge swathes of New York. And they also are famous for their involvement in the hospitality industry, the hotel trade. William Waldorf Astor, who purchases Hever and who lives here, was the builder of the Waldorf Hotel, and his famous cousin, John Jacob Astor, built the Astoria right next door. They were feuding cousins. They weren't particularly fond of each other, but they did have a brief reconciliation, and they merged their neighbouring hotels to create the Waldorf Astoria. And very sadly, William Waldorf's cousin, John Jacob Astor, later died on the Titanic. But William Waldorf, who of course is irrevocably linked to Hever, had a brief period in politics, and he moved to Britain in 1891, stating that America wasn't a civilized country anymore, and that he wanted to become a gentleman of England. And he did indeed become a citizen or subject in 1899, and he's then made a baron in 1916 and becomes Viscount Astor in 1917 for his work with war charities. So he does indeed become an archetypal gentleman of England.
And what did he do here in terms of building then? You've said a few things, but give me some examples of what he did here.
That's a really good question. He really did very little to the layout of the castle, and we've already touched upon that. He was actually really fond of Anne Boleyn's story and wanted to maintain as much of her home as possible. But what he does do is absolutely lavish those rooms with the most beautiful panelling. And not just using oak, he uses Italianate walnut or sabaku. These beautiful, very expensive woods that have a beautiful aroma, and they still do. And he tours the country with his architect, getting inspiration from Jacobean, Elizabethan, Tudor manners, and brings them all to Hever Castle to make this wonderful concoction, feeling very authentic, but actually being relatively new. So he lavishes the ceilings, for example. He takes inspiration from Hampton Court, panelling from Sizer Castle up in Cumbria, beautiful inlaid panelling, which was Elizabethan. He brings that design here to Hever. So he really is making this place feel more Tudor than Tudor, really. It's quite astonishing that how many productions I think have been inspired by this heavy oaken panelled feel that Hever has throughout the castle. The Tudor court wasn't like that at all, and households weren't like that. They were quite garish, actually. You would have had very vibrant tapestry, and often if there was panelling, it would be highlighted with painted friezes or even painted white. And a lot of the chambers would have just been plain plaster wall, again heavily tapestried and filled out with cloth of gold, arras, or other silks or damask. So I do think actually Hever's the look that William Waldorf Astor came up with has been quite influential. You know, Hever is featured in a lot of these Tudor films, and have really given us a sort of a skewed vision of what the Tudor aesthetic actually was. But beyond the castle itself, he does a huge amount to the landscape. Now, of course, in Anne Boleyn's time, this wouldn't have looked anything like it does today, the grounds. It would have been heavily wooded, Kentish weald. But Astor has created a stunning set of different gardens, an Italianate garden. He inserted a vast lake which took over 2 years to create, 800 men working over 2 years to hand dig the lake. And he also wanted to entertain people here. And you may have noticed it's not a particularly big castle. And he didn't want to ruin the integrity of the castle, and therefore he built an extension to it. And he did so by creating a mock Tudor village at the back, which is adjoined to the castle by a bridge at the back. And essentially it looks like a Tudor village with separate dwellings, but it's all an interconnected 100-room complex where Astor would keep and entertain his guests. So he did a vast amount. I mean, putting that in required the moving of the River Eden way back. I mean, this man had a huge fortune, and he wasn't afraid to lavish it here at Hever, and we're very thankful for him for that.
Do we know how much money he actually spent in total?
We do. It was roughly, in 1903 terms, about $10 million. Now, in today's money, that's not far off $1 billion. So, I mean, it was something like a tenth of his fortune, which is just astonishing. And Hever isn't his only big project. I mean, he has Cliveden, which is now famously a lovely hotel. So, you know, and he has other properties. So, you know, you just can't sort of get your head around it, really. But, I mean, the alterations that Astor made aren't to everyone's taste, but I love them. And, you know, people come to see not just the Tudor history. You know, this place has a much longer and deeper history, and the Astors are very much part of that history. So while they were very much sympathetic to the Tudor history here, they did reserve the right to put their own mark on it as well. And we do have some overtly looking Edwardian rooms as well. And I think it's important, you know, for a property of this age and with so much history, that we do reflect as much of that history as possible. So yes, I mean, it's not to everyone's taste, but I love it personally. I think it's really rather wonderful.
We've explored so much already, but Hever is a place which keeps on giving, and I feel it would be wrong to focus only on the more well-known periods of its history. Can we look at, when did the Astors leave Hever, and sort of what happened after that? So we've got the world wars of the 20th century, so
indeed.
Let's go into that.
So I'll talk briefly about the wars, and then tell you about what happened next with the Astors. Mm-hmm. So they end up leaving in 1983, to answer your first question. But they did, you know, Hever wasn't sort of a hotbed for activity during the First and Second World War. John Jacob Astor, who was William Waldorf Astor's son, fights in the First World War. He actually loses a leg in 1918, just 2 months before the end of the war, when a shell shattered very close indeed to him. He was actually saved by his batman, and his batman was gifted the right to lease the famous Henry VIII pub up at the top of the Hever estate for his lifetime. In the Second World War, we have the introduction of things like pillboxes on the estate. They can still be seen today. But its chief function during the Second World War was housing evacuees. So from 1939, we had a number of children who were evacuated to the relative safety of Kent from London. And we know that a lot of the estate houses housed evacuees. We've actually got some incredible footage shot by Rosie Neumann in, I believe, 1941. It's the first colour footage of Hever Castle that we have, and it shows the evacuees being visited by their fathers, by soldiers. It's really quite touching. Tragically, one of the evacuees actually drowned, we believe, in the outer moat. Incredibly sad period of Hever's history, particularly when you consider that the children were evacuated here for reasons of safety. And Hever would have been also surrounded by the defensive features that were put in to the other great threat to the capital, the V-bomb campaigns, which come a bit later in 1944. So there would have been a huge amount of artillery around the estate, because Kent and Sussex was known affectionately as Doodlebug Alley. So all of the V weapons would have been fired from France, would have come across Kent and Sussex, and it was deemed preferable to bring the missiles down in the relatively sparsely populated counties of Sussex and Kent, rather than allow them to carry on their trajectory to the capital. So the nearby fields would have been filled with barrage balloons. They were another line of defence which would have been hoisted to bring down the Doodlebugs, the V1 missiles. And also the skies would have been a hive of activity as well. The third line of defence would have been planes trying to shoot them down and also tip them. And we do know that a number of V1 missiles landed around the estate, though none thankfully damaging any of the properties or indeed the castle. So yeah, it would have had a varied history throughout the wars. And it sort of played its part, we like to think.
Now, there's one last event I want to ask you about, and that is the flooding that happened at the castle, because I understand that quite a lot of things, documents, etc., were lost. So, can you tell me about the flooding, and then also around, what was lost, and then what changes? You've already mentioned a couple already, so if we go back to those, the changes that were made at the castle due to that flooding incident.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. There are actually two really rather major floods in the 20th century. One happens in 1958, and the other happening in 1968, the latter being by far the worst of the two. What happened in that year was a huge level of rainfall, which happened at sort of the end of a period of considerable rainfall. So the ground was incredibly saturated, it came off the hills and swamped the River Eden, which, as we've already mentioned, had been moved by Astor in order to create his Tudor village, the Astor Wing. Now, the newly relocated River Eden burst its banks, of course found its way back to its original course, absolutely floods the Astor Wing to the back of the castle, and then the moats start filling up. We've got two moats. Hever's always had been double moated, and they overflow, and before it was possible to do much about it at all, we had several feet of water flooding the castle. It was really quite devastating for the Astor family. As I said, they'd already had 10 years earlier a flood which had been incredibly costly to restore the castle, but the one in 68 was particularly bad. Indeed, it took really 4 years to dry the castle out properly, which is quite devastating. It meant that a huge amount of the panelling had to be taken out. In fact, the only panelling that was able to remain in situ was the Sabaku panelling in the library, the reason it could stay in situ is it didn't float. It's incredibly dense wood, but the rest of the panelling had started to lift off of the walls. It was damaging it. So yes, it was an incredibly costly disaster. But perhaps the greatest cost were the archives. Astor, when he purchased the castle, we've already mentioned he put the extension on, but below the extension he had a huge warren of cellars installed, and this is where the archives of the castle were located. And so not only was it costly in terms of money, but also costly in terms of our heritage. We really aren't aware of what we lost in that flood. And as an historian, it's quite devastating to think what we could have learned from those documents. And yes, it's rather difficult to think about, to be honest.
It is. There could have been all sorts.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a real tragedy, to be honest.
And did everything just get binned, basically?
Yeah, I think if you think how long it took to dry the castle out, and obviously we had several feet of water in the castle, so the whole of the cellars would have been completely filled with water. So for large periods of time, it was completely, to the ceiling, filled with water. So yes, it's quite a devastating event. You mentioned what alterations were made, and I previously mentioned that a lot of the family actually lived in the Astor wing, and William Wardolph lived in the castle on his own. That the family sort of continued that tradition, and some of the children had rooms not in the castle but in the Astor wing. So that, of course, was underwater, and the creation of 3 gorgeous little bedrooms, affectionately known as the dog kennels because of their size, were created just adjacent to the long gallery. Obviously, it was a safe place to relocate people from the waters below. But also there were additional defensive measures put in place, much better sluice gates to get the water flowing a bit quicker out of the lake, which of course the River Eden feeds into. So yes, the defensive measures that were put in really have prevented us, touch wood, from experiencing anything quite as devastating as happened in 1968. Having said that, we have come close on a number of occasions, and quite often when we're having huge periods of rain, I periodically spend my time frantically looking at the levels of the moat and praying heartily that we won't experience anything quite in that magnitude again.
But there are still many, many treasures at Hever. So before we finish, I want to explore with you some of the amazing artefacts and artworks which people can see on display if they come to visit Hever. So let's begin with the portraits of the castle. I know there are many on display, the majority of which are in the long gallery. How many actually are there on display? Do you know?
Well, I'm not going to give you an exact figure because we have approximately 60 portraits in the castle, and I'm sure our wonderful curator Alison Palmer is cringing because I'm wildly off. But we also have a huge amount of portraiture, not only in the castle itself but in the Astor wing. So that 60 rough total isn't including the vast collection of portraits that we have in our bed and breakfast for our visitors to enjoy. Moreover, we have a number of portraits that are on display, and hopefully they will be in the near future. But we have an archive full of portraits that either were up in the castle or haven't yet been put up in the castle. We have incredibly generous owners, the Guthrie family, who have absolutely transformed our art collection, and in my opinion have created the best privately owned collection of Tudor and Stuart portraiture outside of the National Portrait Gallery. But for example, we also have a number of miniature portraits which we don't have on display currently. So yes, I couldn't give you an exact figure because it's vast. It really is huge. But if you're coming as a visitor, expect to see roughly 60 amazing portraits. I mean, some of them are hugely famous.
So are they all Tudor portraits, the 60-ish? Are they generally Tudor?
Yeah, I mean, the vast majority of that 60 were created in the Tudor era. We have some incredibly rare examples of Tudor portraiture and incredibly famous ones too. But we also do have some 17th and 18th century copies of Tudor portraits. These individuals had a much longer life in terms of the creation of portraiture of them than when they were alive. So yes, for example, we have two portraits of the Boleyn sisters, Anne to the left-hand side of the inner hall fireplace and her sister Mary to the right-hand side. They were created in the 18th century. So while they are based on either sketches or other portraits, they're not contemporary to the era itself.
So do you have any favourites?
Oh gosh, yes I do. I have a number of favourites actually. First and foremost, the Hever Rose portrait of Anne is probably one of the most famous portraits of Anne Boleyn. It has quite a mysterious history at Hever. We're not quite sure when it was purchased. We don't think it was purchased by the Astor family, and it certainly wasn't purchased by the current owners, the Guthries. So it may have a long history of being here at Hever. That's something that Alison, our wonderful curator, and I are trying to pin down. I mentioned the inner hall portrait of Anne Boleyn. That's got a special place in my heart for a number of reasons. Not least that it isn't how we normally see Anne. Anne, of course, is famed for wearing French hoods. And there is a notion that Anne only wore French hoods, or that she was responsible for bringing them to the English court. In fact, we know that Anne wears a variety of different headgear. We know she wears a cap to her trial. We know that she wears an English gable hood to her execution. And of course, she's depicted wearing one in the Most Happy Medal, the only contemporary image of Anne to survive. So I like that image of Anne because it shows that difference. She is wearing an English gable hood. But I also love it because it was, I think, the first painting of Anne Boleyn that I saw face to face when I was a very young child. And I fell in love with it. I think for the sole reason that costume that she's wearing was recreated in Anne of the Thousand Days, and that was my first exposure to Anne Boleyn's story and the reason that I had come to Hever Castle at the age of 4 or 5. So it really fit the bill of what I believed Anne to look like. So yeah, that has a real firm place in my heart. I used to have, as a very young child, a big poster of that painting up in my bedroom. And I think my other favourite portrait is that of Arthur, the king that never was, Henry VIII's elder brother. It's one of the earlier portraits that we own, and it's an incredibly rare one. We believe it's the only portrait of Arthur to survive that was painted in his lifetime. So if you think of all of the wonderful collections in the world, that found at historical palaces and the royal collection, we have the only one of Arthur that has been painted in his lifetime. I do like to brag about that, to be honest. And it's also a very intimate portrait. It's a small portrait, and we believe it was commissioned by Henry VII for the occasion of the engagement of Arthur to Catherine of Aragon. We believe it may have been owned by Catherine of Aragon. So it's a very intimate little portrait that tells a very evocative story of a history that was never able to develop. Arthur, of course, dies prematurely, leaving the spare heir, Henry, to go on and do his thing. So yes, that's another firm favourite of mine. I will draw the line there, because otherwise I will name all 60 of them, because there is not one portrait.
Well, before we move on, then, one of my favourites is the Mary Queen of Scots.
Yes.
Portrait.
Oh gosh,
Do you want to
yes.
tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah, so it's again a very rare portrait of Mary Queen of Scots. Again, I probably shouldn't say this, but we actually outbid a portrait gallery, who I'm sure weren't particularly happy that we got it, but I'm elated. And it shows Mary in half mourning, because she had a trio of deaths around the time that Cleves, the artist, painted this image of her. Her mother had died, her father-in-law, and her husband, Francois. So it shows a young queen, just as she's about to go back to Scotland to sit back on her throne there. And it's just wonderful to have a look at it every day, because it's a rare portrait. There aren't many of Mary Queen of Scots painted in her lifetime, and particularly not at that stage of her life. So yes, it was rather wonderful to learn the news that we were indeed successful in getting her here, and she's become a firm favourite of mine and our visitors.
So what other treasures are there which you think are worth mentioning? Is there anything which people walk past but which you wish they took more notice of?
Yeah, I mean, this really is a treasure trove. Both Astor and our current owners have really invested in beautiful pieces that are both stunning to look at, but also say a lot about the history of this place. One of my favourite artefacts is actually a replica. It's the clock on the mantelpiece of the inner hall. Now, this is a silver copy of a gold clock that Henry is believed to have gifted to Anne Boleyn on her wedding day. And I've always really admired it. I've had on a couple of occasions the privilege of being able to clean it. And I think it's a really small and intimate item that tells us something of their relationship, and of course prophesied, if you want to put it like that, in writing in her Book of Hours, which we also have here at Hever, that the time will come. And I always think to myself, this is Henry saying to Anne, your time has come. So yeah, that's a gorgeous little clock, which it's quite easy to miss, or not really understand the significance of. And I'm particularly fond of it because it was lent by Gavin Astor, the last of the Astors to own Hever, to the production company that produced Anne of the Thousand Days. And it appears on set or rather on Henry VIII's desk when he's signing Anne's death warrant. So yeah, it's got a nice little bit of popular culture history as well. You
mentioned the Book of Hours there. Can you tell? I believe there's two. Can you
Yes.
explain what a Book of Hours is, and then actually specifically about the ones that are here, please?
Yeah, sure. So we are incredibly privileged to own two of Anne Boleyn's Books of Hours. Now, Books of Hours are religious texts. They're chiefly although not exclusively owned by women, certainly used by women, and were generally passed down through from woman to daughter. And so they tend to have a long history of ownership, as both of ours do. The elder of the two books was created circa 1410 to 1450 in Bruges. So it's certainly older than Anne Boleyn. And the other was created in Paris in 1528. So it was created especially for Anne. And she has both inscribed and signed both of the books. Now, these books were, as I said, religious texts. They dictated 8 separate prayers to be said throughout the day, hence a book of hours, set at different times throughout the day. But they also had a calendar of festivals, of prayers to be said for saints, and also prayers to be said for the dead. So they're books that are to be used throughout the day. But getting back to those inscriptions, in the earlier of the two books, Anne has inscribed the book with, in French, le temps viendra, the time will come, je Anne Boleyn, I Anne Boleyn, which is a really powerful and prophetic little statement, which I just adore. And she's adorned it with a drawing of an astrolabe, a timepiece. So I really relish the opportunities when I get to have a look at that inscription. And in the other book, she has written, remember me when you do pray that hope doth lead from day to day, Anne Boleyn. And this book does have a history of being the one that was with Anne in the Tower of London. There is a question mark over that, however, but that's probably a longer story for another time. But yes, they are the two of the greatest treasures that we have here at Hever Castle. Most of the things that survive of Anne Boleyn are books, so it's wonderful to have two of them here at Hever, where she probably used them. It's they are wonderful survivals.
That has been absolutely fascinating. I knew it would be. Thank you so much for joining me today, Owen, and for letting me pick your brains and welcome me to Hever today. It's been fabulous. Thank you.
Couldn't be more welcome. It's absolutely wonderful to have you back here at Hever. It's been too long since you were here, and I hope to welcome you back very soon indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining me today, and a huge thank you to Owen for joining us. It was a very interesting chat, just as I knew it would be, and I really hope you will come and join us on the podcast again soon.